Welcome back, everyone, to Sip and Talk.
Hey there. Good to be back.
So, something kind of funny this morning. I was scrolling through comments, and a few people pointed out, nicely, mostly, that we tend to say the word democracy, maybe?
Yeah.
A lot.
Chuckles lightly. Guilty as charged, I suppose. It's hard to avoid these days, isn't it?
Totally. People are getting, democracy fatigue. They hear it constantly. But, it got me thinking. I saw this analogy. Maybe it works. Maybe it doesn't. Tell me what you think.
Okay. Lay it on me.
Democracy is like a big, messy meeting.
Right.
Everyone gets to talk. It's loud. Maybe nothing gets decided perfectly. People argue.
Uh-huh. I can see that. Noisy.
Exactly. And then communism, or maybe authoritarianism, is like a standard workday. The boss gives a speech, everyone claps politely, end of story. Quiet, efficient, maybe.
Efficient on the surface,
Really, yeah.
perhaps. But you lose the input, the buy-in, the messiness. Right. So does that framing kind of resonate? Don't shoot me down just yet. Anyway, welcome back to Sip and Talk. Today, we're going to lean into that, talking about Taiwan's democracy, which, hey, you listeners picked this focus, so no complaining.
Left? Fair enough. And we've got some great points to discuss, actually sparked by one of our longtime listeners, Mickey. He sent over some really interesting observations.
Yeah, Mickey's fantastic. Okay, so we're tackling 3 big ideas today based on that. First up, this interesting point Mickey made. Taiwan's ruling party, the DPP, and President Lai Ching-te. Maybe they're not actually the most popular, but more like the least disliked. That's a twist.
It really is, and it kind of flips the script on how you might think about their mandate.
Second, President Lai keeps saying democracy over and over. Like, a lot. Some people find it, annoying or empty talk, especially with other issues going on. But is it just a habit, or is it actually a very deliberate signal?
Mm-hmm. A strategic move, perhaps? Cutting through the noise?
And third, this whole idea that the world is kind of splitting into teams, like-minded countries sticking together. Democracies huddle over here, authoritarian states over there. And maybe it's getting harder and harder for these groups to even talk to each other properly.
Because the fundamental values are just too different. It makes trust almost impossible across those lines.
Exactly. So we're going to unpack all that, trying to make sense of the political noise for you.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's start with that first idea from Mickey, which honestly kind of blew my mind a bit. The ruling party, the DPP, isn't the most loved, but the least disliked. What's the story there?
Well, it's a really critical point for understanding Taiwan's political landscape right now. If you just look at the numbers from the 2024 presidential election, Lai Ching-te, the DPP candidate, won. But he only got 40.05% of the vote.
40%. That's nowhere near a majority. That sounds less like a landslide and more like winning because the other options split the rest.
Yeah, precisely. It's not a strong, enthusiastic mandate from the majority of voters. And you see this exact same picture in their parliament, the Legislative Yuan. The DPP only got 51 seats out of 113.
So they don't control the legislature either.
Nope. They're a minority government. The main opposition, the KMT, actually got one more seat, 52. And then there's the newer party, the TPP, with 8 seats, holding a kind of balance of power. So the voters definitely didn't give the DPP a blank check.
Okay, so if they're not getting this overwhelming wave of support, how do they keep winning the presidency? What's the deciding factor?
It really seems to come down to this huge group of voters who are, neutral or unaffiliated. Surveys show this bloc can be massive, sometimes up to 38%. Almost 4 in 10 voters aren't strongly tied to one party.
Wow. Nearly 40%. So if that many people are genuinely on the fence, then elections aren't necessarily about who has the absolute best policies.
It becomes more about who alienates the fewest people, especially within that crucial swing group. And often it seems to boil down to risk aversion.
Risk aversion, meaning?
Meaning, for many of these neutral voters, the biggest risk they perceive is related to China. They see the KMT as potentially pushing Taiwan closer to Beijing, rightly or wrongly. That's the perception. So voting for the DPP isn't always about loving the DPP's domestic plans.
It's about avoiding what they see as the bigger danger, like a better the devil you know kind of thing.
Exactly. It gets framed sometimes as anti-China preservation, or even, less charitably, hate voting against the KMT's perceived stance, rather than for the DPP's platform with huge enthusiasm.
That sounds incredibly unstable, doesn't it? If your support isn't built on active loyalty, but just on being slightly less scary than the alternative.
It makes their position extremely fragile, and the data shows this volatility. President Lai's approval ratings have taken some serious hits already. We saw one poll where his support dropped over 7 points in just 1 month.
Ouch.
Yeah. And his disapproval rating, sometimes hitting around 44.5%, has actually been higher than his approval rating, which might hover around 42.9%. That signals some deep unhappiness, often about domestic stuff.
Right, like the economy, housing, inflation, the things that hit people's daily lives. So they're trying to manage that dissatisfaction at home while also constantly signaling internationally. That's a tough balancing act for a minority government.
It's walking a tightrope, absolutely. Their political survival kind of depends on not messing up too badly on the home front while making sure they remain seen as the strongest defenders of Taiwan's distinct identity against pressure from Beijing.
A very thin tightrope indeed. Okay, so that fragility and domestic unhappiness kind of leads perfectly into our second point, right? This constant repetition of the word democracy. You mentioned Lai used it 31 times in his inaugural speech alone.
31 times, yeah.
When people are worried about their jobs or the price of groceries, hearing democracy, democracy, democracy over and over, I can see why opponents jump on that and call it, empty talk or meaningless rhetoric. Why keep hammering that one word?
Well, based on what we're seeing, it's definitely not just a verbal tick or like a favorite word. It looked like a very calculated, very strategic political move. Think of it as planting a flag, repeatedly. A clear boundary marker.
A boundary marker. Okay, marking a boundary against what? Or for what?
It serves two really vital functions, working both inwards and outwards. First, there's the domestic function. Internally, constantly using democracy reinforces the DPP's core brand, its identity.
Okay.
And it also acts as a kind of shield. When the opposition, the KMT or the DPP, accuses the DPP of maybe becoming too powerful, acting like a green dictatorship or creating a one-party state, the DPP's immediate comeback is built around that word.
How so?
That they can essentially say, look, how can we be authoritarian when our entire political existence is based on championing democracy? It's who we are. It's using the language of legitimacy to defend themselves against attacks on their legitimacy.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Turning the criticism back using the core concept, but you said inwards and outwards. What's the external part? That seems more critical, maybe.
I think it is, arguably. That's the international signal. And for Taiwan, this is absolutely crucial for its survival. By constantly talking about democracy, Taiwan is very deliberately positioning itself within that big global narrative. Democracy versus authoritarianism.
Planting its flag firmly in the democratic camp.
Exactly. It's sending a clear, unambiguous message to its key allies, the U.S., Japan, the G7 countries. It's saying, we share your values. We are on your team. In a world facing pressure from authoritarian models, especially the PRC's model right next door, this is Taiwan's primary diplomatic calling card.
And Beijing definitely hears that signal, right?
Yeah.
I remember after Lai's speech emphasizing sovereignty and democracy, Beijing reacted pretty strongly.
Immediately. They labeled his speech basically a Taiwan independence declaration, which in a way confirms the signal worked. Beijing understood the message was about separation, about fundamental difference based on political systems.
So the repetition isn't just noise, it's broadcasting Taiwan's alignment, cementing its image as like the democratic outpost in the region.
Precisely. It builds that high-trust platform needed for security cooperation, intelligence sharing, all those crucial links with democratic partners.
Okay, but let's loop back to that domestic fatigue we talked about. If the government keeps using the word democracy, but people at home feel like their everyday problems aren't being solved, does the word start to lose its power? Does it become just background noise?
That is the inherent risk. That's the tightrope again. If the rhetoric isn't backed up by visible action and results on domestic issues, effective policies on the economy, maybe constitutional reforms people care about, more transparency, then yes, you risk semantic fatigue.
Semantic fatigue, meaning the word just gets tuned out.
Exactly. Or worse, it starts to ring hollow. The government becomes vulnerable to the charge of being all talk, no action. And that feeds directly back into those shaky approval ratings and domestic dissatisfaction we discussed.
So the strength of that really important international signal actually depends on the democracy feeling real and functional back home.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can't just export the brand. The product itself needs to be solid. The perceived health of Taiwan's democracy at home directly impacts the credibility of its signal abroad.
Makes total sense. One depends on the other. All right, let's zoom out now to the bigger picture. We've talked about signaling to allies, building trust, and this connects to the third main point that came up, this idea of a global huddle or echo chamber, like the world is splitting into groups that only talk to themselves.
Yeah, that huddle phenomenon, or thinking about it like those high school lunch tables, is a pretty good analogy for what's happening. Global politics today seems increasingly defined by these ideological camps.
Why is that happening now, do you think?
Well, the thinking is that shared fundamental values, things like belief in human rights, rule of law, free elections on one side, versus maybe state control, collective stability over individual rights on the other, these create the bedrock for deep trust.
And trust is key for alliances.
It's everything, especially when you're talking about sensitive cooperation, like sharing intelligence or coordinating defense strategies. You can only really do that effectively if you fundamentally trust your partner's system and intentions, which often stems from shared core values.
Okay, so let's map out these lunch tables. Who's sitting where?
Well, you've got the democracy camp. Think NATO, the Quad Alliance, that's the US, Japan, India, Australia groups, explicitly focused on principles like a free and open world, democratic norms. Their cooperation goes way beyond just trade deals. It's deep security partnerships built on that shared ideological foundation.
Okay, table one, democracies.
Yeah.
And across the cafeteria.
You have the authoritarian camp. The most prominent example lately is the No Limits Partnership declared between China and Russia.
Yeah.
You also see groups like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO.
What binds them together?
Often, it's a shared interest in maintaining state control, pushing back against perceived Western interference, sometimes cooperation on things like surveillance tech, and coordinating stances in international bodies to counter democratic initiatives. They actively reject the core principles of the other table.
So if these two tables basically disagree on fundamental values, how do they even negotiate or solve problems together? Does it just not happen?
It becomes incredibly difficult. Communication often breaks down because they're operating from such different starting points, different definitions of what's right or legitimate. Short-term economic deals might happen, sure, but deep, lasting cooperation on major global issues, almost impossible.
You see this gridlock in places like the UN sometimes, right?
Absolutely. Look at votes in the UN Human Rights Council. On contentious issues that touch these core value divides, you often see massive splits, maybe 70% voting one way, 30% the other, clearly along these camp lines. The fundamental disagreement prevents consensus. There's just very little trust to cross that divide.
Which brings us right back to Taiwan. Their whole democracy diplomacy strategy is basically about making sure they have a secure seat at the democratic lunch table, isn't it?
It's the ultimate example of finding your tribe, or like-minded grouping, as the analysts call it. Look at Taiwan's efforts to build ties with countries like Lithuania or the Czech Republic.
Yeah, those were interesting cases. Why them specifically?
Because those nations have their own relatively recent historical memories of living under and resisting authoritarian rule, Soviet influence in their case. So they share a deep value-based understanding and sympathy with Taiwan's situation.
And they've supported Taiwan even when it caused economic problems with China, right?
Exactly. Lithuania, especially, faced significant economic pressure from Beijing for allowing Taiwan to open a representative office using the name Taiwan. But they largely held firm. It shows that for these countries, the alliance isn't just about dollars and cents. It's driven by deeply held, shared democratic values.
So that huddle based on values can actually be stronger than economic threats sometimes.
It can be. It demonstrates the power of that ideological alignment. The choice to stand with Taiwan, for countries like Lithuania, is fundamentally an ideological statement, not just an economic calculation. And that's a really crucial dynamic for understanding Taiwan's place in the world today.
Wow. Okay, that really paints a clear picture of the global landscape they're navigating. #tag summary and final thought.
So just to quickly wrap up the main threads here for you. First, we talked about how Taiwan's current government isn't necessarily riding a wave of huge popularity. Instead, their power seems partly based on being the least disliked major option, which creates this really fragile domestic political scene sensitive to everyday issues like the economy.
Right. And second, that constant talk about democracy, which might sound repetitive or even annoying to some, isn't just talk. It's actually a crucial, very strategic signal, both inward to define the DPP against opponents and outward to lock in Taiwan's place with democratic allies like the US and Japan, clearly marking a line against Beijing.
And finally, this signaling is so important because the world seems to be increasingly dividing along these ideological lines. You've got these value-based camps, and deep trust and cooperation really only happen within those camps. Taiwan absolutely needs to maximize its standing within the democratic group for its own security and survival.
Okay, so putting it all together, here's the thought I kind of want to leave you, the listener, with. We've established that democracy is maybe Taiwan's most vital international lifeline. They're a key signal for survival and alliances. But if that very word, democracy, because it's used so much and maybe disconnected from solving pressing domestic problems like housing or wages. If it keeps leading to that high public fatigue and dissatisfaction we see in the polls, could that fatigue at home actually start to weaken the strength of the signal abroad?
That's a really sharp question.
Like, can the symbol remain powerful internationally if the substance feels shaky or unsatisfying to people living it day to day? Is the domestic weariness potentially undermining the international strategy, even unintentionally?
That tension between the domestic reality and the international messaging. Yeah, that's definitely something to watch closely in the coming months and years. A very real challenge.
Food for thought. That's all the time we have for today here on Sip and Talk. Thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our next conversation.
And a big shout out again to our listener, Mickey, for sparking today's discussion with those insights.
Oh, yeah. And hey, check out Mickey's own YouTube channel. It's called Mickytolife. He does fun stuff, memes, music, food tastings, travel vlogs, really entertaining. Mickytolife on YouTube. Go give it a look.
Definitely worth checking out.
All right, everyone. Thanks again. We'll catch you next time on Sip and Talk.
Hey there, welcome to Mickey's World, aka Mickey to Life. This isn't one of those clean-cut, neatly categorized channels. Nope, it's more like a lifestyle bodega, a little bit of everything and all of it with heart. When we eat seriously. When we drink, we savor the world. This channel dives into 6 main themes: food, booze, daily life, music, comedy, and travel. All seen through Mickey's eyes and brain, showing you perspectives you've never thought of and places you probably never planned to visit. And don't sleep on the podcast Sip and Talk. You know what it is, this one's got soul. It's not just casual chatter, it's thoughtful, sometimes deep, always real. From everyday life to hard-hitting topics like the future of AI, philosophical debates, geopolitics, and the complex dance of international affairs. This show challenges the way you see the world and invites you to question it too. There's no one right answer here, but every episode worth sipping slowly. If you're the kind of person who likes to laugh while your brain's exploding with ideas, if you love food and travel, but also want to rethink the rhythm of life, then yeah, you should definitely be part of Mickytolife. Join the crew, be a fellow Sip and Talk warrior. And hey, subscribing won't even cost you a bowl.